anyway, with all of that said, lots of news, busy week. We're gonna have trouble getting through all of it. And I think we have to start with the big news that took a year to unfold. We actually just watched the video segment from a year ago when we were sure that the Informatica acquisition by Salesforce was about to happen. It was rumored and then apparently it fell apart. And then, sort of out of the blue, this time the news cycle lasted like 2 whole days.
Yes.
It closed, and now suddenly Informatica is owned by Salesforce. And I think I look back and watch the video, and I certainly have sort of a different perspective on it now, maybe a different appreciation for it. So I'll let you cue it up and kind of give your thoughts on what you think what you think of it, and has your opinion changed in the last year?
Yeah. At a big picture level, the Salesforce has announced its intention to acquire Informatica. It's going to be an $8 billion acquisition. And from a high level perspective, this makes sense because Informatica has been mostly PE owned, private equity owned for a while. They're also publicly traded, but there was a big stake owned by Permira Partners, as well as the Canadian Pension Fund. And they have gotten their money back, but obviously they have been owning their stake for about 10 years now, and that's usually a good time frame for entering and exiting a private investment. So it's good timing from that perspective. But also it's a good move because, as we've discussed before, Salesforce has become a data company. Their platform is extremely important to them. Their ability to work with other solutions is important. And with Agentforce, they are making a play to become an enterprise-wide technology play, which requires access to data. So I think a lot of these things make sense at a high level. They made sense a year ago and they still make sense now. I'm curious to see where
Yeah, I
your
think
opinion changed.
Yeah, well, I think it changed a little bit insofar as the world of AI has changed. I mean, if you go back a year ago, we didn't really have Agentforce, right? And so
Right.
from a pure data standpoint, it was a little less obvious. I think what is interesting is, from an AI perspective, we've talked about AI is, and we actually talked about it during the show, but we talked about it from the context of digital transformation, and in the early stages, it was all about process and data. And I think that is even more true now. And I think one of the more interesting analyses is a woman who I don't know, Prukalpa, co-founder of a data company called Atlan, and she wrote this interesting sort of analysis. And what she pointed out was that in the news around all of this, that there was very little talk about data integration, which of course we all think of the bread and butter of what Informatica is all about, and that instead it was all about metadata and governance. And I think that was very enlightening and very insightful in terms of what this is really all about. That as we see Salesforce, ServiceNow, and some of these others really sort of start battling out on the agentic AI front, understanding that data is the underlying component, that it really is going to come down to this idea of governance, metadata, lineage, of being able to validate the veracity of the data, because you now have agents that are attempting to work autonomously on top of it. And if you can't control that scope, then you have unpredictability with it. So I thought that was interesting. Again, it speaks to the one thing that I question. In fact, she has a horse in this fight with the company called Atlan, but I
Mhm.
think she makes a very strong point. Certainly, a point that we at Symphony are making to a certain extent in a different dimension. But this idea that as Salesforce and ServiceNow and some of the others, SAP, are trying to build this sort of end-to-end monolithic view of all of this, that it's sort of they're betting that someone's going to invest and effectively put all their eggs in their basket, right? And I think that there is a heck of a case to be made at certain levels where that you want a degree of independence, that you want a degree of agnosticism, so that you're not having all those eggs in one basket. And the reality is, I don't think any organization is ever going to be fully invested where everything is in a single platform, at least not in a major one. And so I thought it's interesting sort of on both fronts. And there's one other interesting aspect to it, which I'll get to in a second. But I mean, what is your take on that? I mean, so that's why I'm sort of probably more
Mhm.
positive on it, because that makes a lot more sense to me. Does that ring true with sort of how you're seeing it?
Yeah, a year ago, basically, when we looked at bringing outside data into models and AI, we basically had retrieval augmented generation, but we didn't have some of these newer things about model context protocol, agent to agent, the entire area of agent orchestration that has shown up over the past year. A lot of things just weren't there last year. And even so, it made some sense to make go in this direction. But I also think it's interesting that increasingly we're seeing Salesforce being bifurcated to some degree. You've got the sales, service, and marketing stuff that is really like core Salesforce applications. And now we have, call it Tableau and Slack and Informatica, which are, I would say, more vendor
And
neutral.
MuleSoft?
uh, MuleSoft to some extent, but I think MuleSoft has been pulled a little bit more into Salesforce over time, and honestly, kind of deprecated. It's getting a little long in the tooth, which is part of why the Informatica acquisition also made sense. There's obviously overlap in the integration space between MuleSoft and Informatica, but even when I've been at Dreamforce or Trailblazer events over the past year, I've definitely seen how MuleSoft is kind of being treated as this legacy product, and if you want to do the cool stuff, you should really adopt Agentforce or use some of the cooler Slack based or action based activities. So that's part of the reason they needed Informatica as well. They needed just a newer,
Yeah.
more updated product.
Well, so my last two observations around this is when I watched back our video from a year ago,
Mhm.
and my core point, which is I remain, it's to it's me, bleh. My core point still holds true, in that I remain concerned that Salesforce is becoming too big, too diverse, that it's getting tougher and tougher to get that sort of consolidated vision, all of Benioff's efforts to the contrary notwithstanding, um, to really understand, like almost like what you're saying, right? All these different moving parts and pieces. And that I think that is going to become challenging. And it's I listen to a great podcast that I listen to called Lenny's something, but where they talk about product managers, and one of them was a startup. It was a product manager, the chief product officer for a startup, and one of their claim to fame is just this ability to kind of be lean and mean and fast. And what's interesting about it is that Salesforce and arguably ServiceNow are following in the very long tradition of these very large companies that, in order to keep growing, in order to keep hitting their numbers, they just have to keep acquiring, and they end up just becoming sort of it's bloat, right? And they're definitely providing value within the enterprise, but um, it just gets harder and harder to be able to say, hey, this is this compelling vision, and to get that sort of startup mentality. My last little observation, though, was the relative value degradation, I guess is what I'd
Mhm.
say, of Informatica. I mean, this is a 5x multiple from their revenue to acquisition. And I compare it to, say, ServiceNow's recent acquisition of MoveWorks, which was a 25 times multiple. And I find that fascinating, right? Ostensibly because if I had to pick and choose here in terms of what has a greater long-term value, I would think something like Informatica really does. It's a much more core piece of technology. Um, but I do find it interesting where how companies are being valued right now in this age of AI. That if you're a core AI player, your valuation is significantly higher.
Right. And Informatica is definitely the stickier of the and more infrastructure vital of those two companies. I totally agree there. But I think the margins involved and the financial modeling involved make that more difficult. Without going into detail, I had a client last year looking at Informatica, and they thought that the real price of the Informatica stock was around this mid 20s range, which is what the sale price ended up being. And it spent a lot of time, call it around 16, 17, or 18. So this investor thought, it doesn't matter that the numbers have, I'm telling you the numbers because without the details, like the numbers don't mean anything. But fundamentally, that the stock was underpriced by a whole bunch based on the stability of the company and the actual revenues that were involved. So this seems to be a fair outcome, but it does seem that Informatica might have missed a chance to get a bigger outcome, as we were talking about an $11 billion purchase last year, and this ended up being an $8 billion price, which was, the fair neutral price. I think Benioff got a great deal for what it's worth for what this is. And I also think this is interesting because Informatica has a significant footprint in India. So this now increases Salesforce's workforce and executive footprint in India, which is obviously a huge and important strategic market right now in this US-China political detente, where India seems to be kind of the third party neutral player in the middle.
Yeah, absolutely. So no, I think overall this is probably good for both. We'll see how this shakes out. I think it will be. I mean, I think that for Informatica, it could have gone a lot of ways. I think this is probably one of the better. If they were going to end up in acquisition, this was probably one of the better landing places for them.